Hello, as Raquel and Simon have already announced, I'm going to be presenting the intervention logic, which is to be used in CAP strategic planning. So what is this? I'm pretty sure that everybody has at least heard of it before, but anyway, I'll give it a few words. So it's not so much a tool as it is more of a framework or a way of thinking that helps to link the certain identified problems that are that exist in relation to a topic and their drivers with the policy options that we have available. And so it enables a logical pathway from the actions that we're going to implement to the expected outcomes from these actions. Why would we use it? Simone stated earlier that there are demands from the policy level already that demand us to have a coherent policy, an evidence-based policy, transparency and accountability. And this is one of the main tools to enable such policy. Using a proper intervention logic helps us to optimize resource allocation. In case of changing circumstances, it supports adaptability, so we're more flexible when stuff changes. It links our strategy to the delivery of results in a measurable way and allows us to track progress. It helps to communicate with stakeholders, to justify intervention choices to both taxpayers and stakeholders. By making our logic clear, it improves buy-in from stakeholders, and it also forms a basis for the performance monitoring of our actions. And if this is not enough for you, it's also demanded by the CAP strategic plans regulation. So it's actually a must in forming our CAP strategic plans. There are a few staples, so main elements to the intervention logic. First, we start from the definition of needs. So under the CAP strategic plans process, usually we do this with a SWOT analysis, which is also an obligation under the regulation. And based on these needs and the situational analysis, we define our objectives, which must, of course, be aligned with the CAP strategic goals, so the general and specific goals. Then we define our interventions, so what we're actually going to be doing. Obviously, again, under the CAP, this is largely predefined by the available measures and their financial allocations. We define our outputs, so these are the measurable results of our actions, our results. In the short term, and then our more long-term impacts. So applying the intervention logic is actually important along the entire CAP strategic plan process and also between different strategic planning cycles. But it's most prominent in the design phase when we very explicitly build this logical coherence among the different components of the CAP strategic plan. And it's important and useful to go back to the intervention logic during the implementation phase because it guides our monitoring and adaptation over the course of the implementation. And then during the monitoring phase also, it allows us to assess whether our interventions actually deliver the desired results as we defined them at the beginning of the design process. So if we look at the step-by-step logic, even though it seems linear, we can always go back to previous steps and reconfirm whether our initial assumptions were correct. So first, we try to define what the problem is. And here we obviously use as much data as we can and situational analysis that are available, at least the SWOT analysis, as I stated before. Based on this, we define our objectives, which should be as measurable as possible. And this means, so where do we want to go? Where do we want to be in a certain period of time? And as much as possible, these objectives should be SMART, so specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. And then comes the main, so the core of the intervention logic. So the intervention strategies, as I stated already before, inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and impacts. So inputs are, what are we actually going to put into the policy, such as funding, such as knowledge, and other resources. Activities, which means what are we actually going to be doing? For example, under the CAP, this means we're going to be financing, for example, agri-environmental measures. Then we look at the outputs, meaning this is usually a pretty formal element of the intervention logic. Usually it means, for example, we're going to be financing X amounts of farms for this measure. We look at the outcomes, which means so many farms will be so many hectares will be in the measure, and then the impacts, which are actually the content of our policy. So, for example, we will reduce the decline of farmland bird species with this measure by X%, for example. So obviously we need to select from the available options that the CAP provides and any national measures. And as Simona stated earlier, as much as possible, it's important to also try to assess coherence with any other policies. So not only within the CAP and of the measures of the CAP measures with each other, but also with other policy measures. So we don't create at one side and then destroy on the other side. And then we select our indicators, which will help us to measure how we're doing, whether we're actually achieving our goals. So the CAP's performance monitoring and evaluation framework already provides many of these indicators. In my opinion, some of them could still be a little more linked to the actual impacts of the policy, but those are the basic ones that are available to us. And then, obviously, this is maybe not so much a formal part of the intervention logic anymore, but we want to know whether we have achieved our goals. So we should check and monitor how we're doing. And in the end, based on this, evaluate how we did. And what you have here in the image is the policy cycle. So the entire process, in fact, should be circular, not linear. What happens often with intervention logic is that we don't really establish the links between the different elements very well or very clearly. So our objectives may be vague, the links may not be so logical. Sometimes we start from the other end, so from the financing end, and build back towards the objectives, which is really something that we shouldn't do, but often that is actually the case. And there are often cases where stakeholders did not provide input at the appropriate stage. So the result may be a kickback or resistance from, for example, farmers to implement measures because the logic isn't clear or the buy-in isn't good. So it's good to also pair building this intervention logic with the other tools, like Simona showed earlier. The more we engage with these tools, the better the likely outcome will be. And in my opinion, also the smaller the resistance. I think it's important to define the assumptions that we're using as early as possible, and also the risks that might be linked to the implementation, because our intervention logic is not the only thing that is influencing the final outcomes of our policy process. There are also other elements affecting this, and we need to take this into account. And as I indicated earlier, we should try to use participatory validation processes as much as possible. I have provided for those of you who may be interested some more useful resources. There are quite a few useful websites and tools out there. Obviously, there's our deliverable 3.3, which I encourage you to look at. But also there are other web pages, because the intervention logic is not something that is tied only to policymaking or CAP policymaking. It's actually a principle that's used often in project implementation. So there are many resources available. For example, there's actually a specialized application called LogFramer, which can help you to structure your intervention logic, including defining indicators, assumptions, and so on. The European Court of Auditors also has a web page on this. I showed one of their schemes earlier in one of my slides, so I also encourage you to look at that. And with that, I will thank you.